Before you judge the calm, remember this. One lie can hide in the brightest room. What if the lawyer sitting across from you knew more about your husband's death than you ever would? Today, I'm opening a will that could destroy my family, and trust me, this is only the beginning. My name is Margaret Hale, and what you're about to hear are the echoes of a life divided between love, loss, and truth. If my story touched you, stay close. Subscribe, and walk with me through every chapter. The room was too bright for grief. Sunlight sliced through the blinds, catching the slow drift of dust like tiny confetti I hadn't ordered. A pen ticked against the table, tap, tap, steady as a metronome, slow as a heartbeat, trying not to be heard. The man with the pen wore a dark suit and the practiced quiet of someone who has watched many families try to compose themselves. He leaned closer, voice held low as if we were co-conspirators in an honest crime. "Trust no one," he said, "not even the kind faces." I was still learning how to breathe without counting. I nodded because nodding requires less oxygen than speaking. The page in front of me wavered, the letters rippling like minnows under glass. He called it a will. I called it an earthquake that arrived in envelopes. The seal had broken with a whisper earlier, and it felt wrong that important things made such small sounds. To my left, Daniel sat as if the chair had been built just for him, back straight, jaw set, the kind of posture men wear when they think control is a jacket they can keep on, no matter the weather. Claire had angled herself between us, hands folded over her knee, a peacemaker's quiet folded neatly like a handkerchief. Emma's fingers traced the seam of her blouse, her eyes moving from the blinds to the pen, from the pen to me, counting the beats I couldn't keep. Somewhere behind us, Nora adjusted her bracelet, a soft gold clink, like a tiny bell rung for good manners. The lawyer cleared his throat, turned a page, and the pen ticked again. Tap. "We'll go through this carefully," he said. "Fairly." That word bumped against my ribs. Fairness had stopped at the door weeks ago and never returned my calls. I watched his hands more than his mouth. Hands tell the truth. They tremble, they clutch, they tap out messages they'd rather keep hidden. He read aloud the formal phrases that make loss look organized. The living are invited to nod at the right moments, grateful for the scaffolding of legal language because it looks like certainty from a distance. I had learned since childhood that certainty is a light on a long hallway. It looks close until you start walking. My husband's name, Robert, arrived on the page as if no one had turned it into a past tense. The letters still held the warmth of the man who used to leave tea steaming by my bedside when winter crawled into my bones. Reading his name there felt like answering the door to a stranger wearing his coat. The lawyer paused for effect, and I realized how training makes even silence behave. "Mrs. Hale," he said gently, "as we proceed, I need to remind you, conversations around estates can complicate loyalties. Trust no one, not absolutely." He looked directly at me then, and something unlit flared in his eyes, a candle suddenly remembering what flame is. I felt a small, purposeful chill pass along my wrists. Advice like that is a strange charity, generous on the surface, costly once you cash it. I thought of the night before, the house exhaling after everyone had gone to bed, floorboards shifting like an old man turning over. I had opened the living room window just enough to let in air and the sound of the world continuing. The curtains lifted and settled like a tide respecting the furniture. In the corner, the box of Robert's letters waited. The string around it crossed twice, an X like a kiss and a warning. I didn't open it. There are moments when memory is a room with too many doors. "Here," the lawyer said now, anchoring the room back into formality, "is the summary of assets and designations." The words had the chilly efficiency of hospital light. He started listing properties and accounts, dates like stepping stones across a stream I wasn't ready to cross. Daniel asked questions the way men hail taxis, brisk, expecting to be seen, certain of the route. Nora's gaze flicked toward him, then settled where money tends to settle. Claire's silence softened the edges. Emma's breath synced with mine until it didn't. She closed her eyes as if she could listen better in the dark. I watched the lawyer's pen hover over a line, a swimmer pausing mid-stroke. A tiny pause, a micro-stutter, the kind of hesitation that says the body remembers what the mouth forgets. Then he moved on, words smooth again, the river pretending it had no stones. "Everything here," he said, "will be straightforward to execute." Straightforward. I tasted the word the way you taste milk past its date. One cautious sip, then the quiet certainty that you know when something is not right. It wasn't a loud wrong, not the kind that breaks plates and shouts names. It was a soft wrong, the kind that lives in paperwork and tone, the kind that survives on politeness and the hope that everyone is too tired to notice. He slid a page toward me. There were notes in the margins, written in a precise, careful hand. Not his, too personal for that, nor mine, nor the brittle, angular script Robert used when he wrote grocery lists and left jokes in the margins for me to find. These letters had a calm about them, like someone riding on a moving train without missing a curve. "Initial here," he said. The pen found my fingers before my mind did. I felt the weight of it, the cool barrel, the way it balanced like a small bird on a wrist. I didn't write. Instead, I listened to the room. The hum in the walls, the clock keeping time with the lawyer's pen, the faint hiss of air through the vent. House sounds that don't lie. "Is there a concern?" he asked softly. Concern. Another careful word. I thought of kitchens and recipes, how a pinch of something can tilt a whole dish. Grief is like that. One unmeasured emotion, and everything tastes different. I set the pen down, gently, as if it were telling me it had miles to go before it could sleep. "My husband," I said, surprised at how steady my voice sounded, was particular about the way things were written. He believed ink had manners. A few polite smiles. The lawyer's didn't reach his eyes. "We all knew Robert's standards," he said. Yes, standards. And yet the margin note by the third paragraph did not sound like him. It sounded like an echo stepped into the room wearing his shoes. The letters curved where his were angular. The phrasing reached for an intimacy he saved for private rooms and late hours. A line about intentions and best possible outcomes. Robert never wrote best possible. He wrote exact. He believed possibility was how people hid their laziness. I looked up to meet Emma's eyes. She gave me the smallest nod, the kind that says, "I hear what you haven't said." Daniel cleared his throat. In his language, that meant, "Let's not embarrass ourselves." Nora shifted her bracelet again. Claire's fingers pressed lightly into my forearm, present without pressure. "Take your time," the lawyer said. The pen tapped once, as if to remind us it had a schedule. There are moments you can feel your life splitting into before and after, and yet the room looks the same. Same sunlight, same dust, same polite voices. Only you feel the tilt, the way a boat feels the tug of an unseen current. I remembered the day Robert taught our children to swim, his hand under their bellies in the shallow end, the promise that he wouldn't let go until they learned to float on their own. He kept his promise in that pool. In this room, I felt the water rise around my ankles, cool and certain. "Shall we proceed?" he asked. "Please," I said, because politeness is a key that opens many doors. It also locks you inside if you're not careful. He turned another page. The pen stopped ticking. In the brief silence, I heard my own pulse, a quiet knock at a closed door. And then it came. A line that didn't fit where it had been placed, a sentence that sounded like a chair dragged half an inch across the floor. Small, but it rearranged the air between us. Something in the inventory was wrong. Not loud wrong, not obvious wrong, but wrong enough that my breath knew it before my mind did. I slid my finger under the edge of the paper and lifted it slightly, as if the truth had been tucked underneath for safekeeping. The lawyer smiled without teeth. Daniel leaned forward, ready to fix what wasn't broken. Claire whispered my name. Emma's hand found the hem of her blouse again. I didn't say which line it was. Not yet. I let the moment sit between us, quiet as a held note, steady as a metronome, waiting for the first person to blink. I didn't sleep that night. Grief has its own schedule, and it doesn't respect calendars or clocks. Sometimes it arrives politely, sits at the edge of the bed, and waits for you to notice it. Other times, it kicks the door open and reminds you that silence has teeth. That night, it came as a low hum in the walls, the kind of sound you can't tell if it's inside or outside of you. After Robert's death, people spoke of closure as if it were a room you could enter once and lock behind you. I discovered it was more like fog, something that wraps around your throat just when you think you're breathing clearly again. Everyone had advice. Daniel said, "You should trust the process." Claire whispered, "Let's keep the peace." And Emma, dear Emma, only said, "Don't let quietness turn into surrender." The lawyer's warning kept echoing, "Trust no one." At first, I thought it was just a legal precaution, a professional reflex meant to sound wise. But there was something about his tone, that calm certainty that carries more experience than empathy. I wanted to ask him why. I should have. Instead, I carried his words like a secret inside my handbag, beside tissues and a fountain pen that no longer wrote smoothly. The house had changed its sound since Robert left. Even the ticking of the kitchen clock had grown hesitant, as if unsure whether to keep time for one or two. I found comfort in arranging small things, silverware, letters, the folded napkins he liked, the kind of rituals that make order look like control. When the world feels tilted, we rearrange chairs and call it balance. Robert had trusted that lawyer for years. "Carter's a man of principle," he used to say. I never questioned it. Trust was part of our household vocabulary. We trusted the bank, the doctor, the seasons, each other. Or at least I believed we did. Looking back, I realized trust is rarely mutual. Sometimes it's just one person resting while the other keeps watch. The morning after the reading, I walked into Robert's study. The smell was still his, cedarwood, ink, and something faintly medicinal, like menthol and old pages. Dust had begun to settle on the framed photograph of our wedding day. I lifted it gently and saw a faint mark on the desk where it had stood for decades, a square of lighter wood, a ghost of loyalty. I opened the drawer where he kept documents, tax receipts, handwritten notes, half-used notebooks. In one of them, I found a letter addressed not to me, but to anyone who needs clarity when I can't provide it. His handwriting was unmistakable, angular, firm, the strokes of a man who believed words were the spine of truth. But the letter stopped halfway through a sentence, as if he had been interrupted mid-thought. The pen mark dragged slightly, like a breath caught and never exhaled. Emma entered quietly, holding a cup of tea. "You're searching," she said. Not asking, just stating what she saw. That was her gift, naming things without judgment. "I'm remembering," I replied. "It helps me think." She nodded and placed the cup beside me. "Remembering isn't always thinking, Mother. Sometimes it's listening." After she left, I reread the unfinished letter. The words spoke of fairness, of making things clear and equal for all. Robert had written, "I've made sure the document leaves no room for confusion. Carter will..." And then nothing. Just the drag of the pen. Carter, the lawyer. For a long moment, I stared at that name. I imagined his calm voice, the precision of his diction. Trust no one. Perhaps he had meant it as a warning, or perhaps as a confession disguised as advice. By afternoon, Daniel came by. His way of checking on me always looked like an inspection. "Mother," he said, standing in the doorway as though stepping inside might stain his shoes, "you shouldn't dwell on paperwork. The man knows what he's doing." "I'm sure he does," I said softly. "Then why the hesitation yesterday?" "Because hesitation often tells a story before words do." He sighed, the kind of sigh that carries impatience disguised as care. "You're tired. Leave these things to me." His tone was affectionate, but it had the finality of a verdict. I watched him adjust his cufflinks, the same nervous habit Robert used to have. For a moment, the resemblance made my stomach tighten. "I trust you, Daniel," I said. "I just don't trust how easily you trust others." That evening, I called Dr. Carter, not the lawyer, but Samuel Carter, our family physician. His calm voice filled the receiver like a warm coat. "Samuel," I said, "is it possible for grief to sharpen intuition instead of dull it?" "Entirely possible," he answered. "Grief strips noise. What remains is signal." His words stayed with me. Maybe the strange discomfort I felt wasn't paranoia. Maybe it was the signal. Later that night, I returned to Robert's study. The air felt heavier, as if the room itself knew I was trespassing into something sacred. I opened the folder that held copies of the will drafts. Inside were two versions, one clean typed copy with signatures, another a handwritten draft marked with pencil notes. My eyes traced the handwriting in the margins, gentle, cursive, almost elegant, not Robert's. One of the notes read, "A just clause for secondary heir consideration. Maintain discretion." It was dated 3 weeks before Robert's final hospitalization. But Robert couldn't have written it then. He was barely conscious by that point. I ran my thumb over the indentation left by the pencil, the way one touches a scar. The graphite shimmered faintly under the lamp. My pulse quickened. For the first time since his death, I wasn't just mourning him. I was questioning the world that had surrounded him. I looked again at that calm handwriting. It felt deliberate, practiced, like someone writing not for clarity, but for cover. And then I noticed something I had missed before. A faint imprint of another line beneath the visible one, as if a sheet had been pressed hard against it once. I tilted the paper under the light, and there it was, the ghost of another note, partly erased. The words were faint but clear enough to read, "He doesn't need to know." The air seemed to tighten, as if the walls had leaned in to listen. I closed the folder, heart steady but cold. "Trust no one," he'd said. Now I understood. He hadn't meant the world. He had meant this room. I spent the following days pretending that everything was fine. Pretending, I discovered, is a form of survival. It buys time until courage learns how to speak. The children came and went, Daniel with his schedules and logic, Claire balancing peace like porcelain in her hands, Emma hovering near me like quiet light. Only Nora seemed untouched by the tension, her tone always perfectly measured, her smile rehearsed for an audience that had long gone home. When the house emptied, I returned to the study. Each night, I'd tell myself I was only tidying, that I couldn't sleep with papers scattered across the desk. But in truth, I was following an instinct, the same kind that makes animals sense a storm before the clouds form. The first thing I noticed was the order that didn't belong. Robert's files had always been messy in a deliberate way. Notes tucked between receipts, envelopes half opened, his handwriting traveling across margins like vines. Now everything looked arranged, almost sterilized. Folders perfectly stacked, labels typed, dates aligned. I remember thinking, someone cleaned this, who didn't understand his chaos. I turned on the small desk lamp. Its yellow light fell over the documents like morning on snow, beautiful but revealing every footprint. I started checking the dates, line by line, medical bills, insurance forms, property documents, and then legal correspondence. The lawyer's letters were precise, each signed with his delicate looping RC initials that suddenly looked less like a mark of professionalism and more like ownership. I opened the top drawer and found a small leather notebook, unfamiliar. Inside were brief notes, reminders, contact numbers, and 2 dates circled in blue ink, May 14th and June 2nd. Between them, Robert had been in the hospital, sedated most of the time. There was no reason he could have met with anyone, much less reviewed legal documents. June the 2nd was the date the final version of the will had been printed. That discovery sat in my chest like a pebble in a shoe, small, but impossible to ignore once you feel it. I needed perspective, not panic. So, I called Dr. Carter again. He met me the next afternoon at his clinic, his calm eyes the same color as overcast skies, steady, neutral, knowing how to hold someone's fear without feeding it. "Samuel," I said, lowering my voice, "did you ever see Robert awake between May and June?" He hesitated just long enough for truth to slip through the pause. "Not coherently," he said. "Why?" "Because someone made him sign something during that time." The doctor's brow furrowed. "Are you certain?" "About the dates, yes. About the signatures. I'm beginning to wonder." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he offered the quiet of his office as comfort. "Grief sharpens you," he said finally, "but it can also distort. Be careful which edge you trust." His words lingered as I walked back home. Be careful which edge you trust. Maybe the blade wasn't mine at all. That night, I visited Reverend Whitmore. His home smelled of tea leaves and old sermons. He welcomed me with the gentleness of someone who has seen too many confessions. "Reverend," I began, "what does one do when trust begins to feel like blindness?" He smiled, not with humor, but with recognition. "You open your eyes," he said simply, "and you ask who benefits from them being closed." His answer felt like a door unlocking quietly in the dark. I didn't stay long. When I left, the night air was cool, the streets damp from earlier rain. Streetlights stretched long shadows that followed me like loyal witnesses. The next morning, I began my investigation, not with confrontation, but with observation. I searched through emails, invoices, and handwritten notes. I compared fonts, letterheads, and the rhythm of language. The lawyer wrote in a tone that was almost too smooth, every phrase crafted to sound protective. I recognized it now as a kind of legal lullaby, words meant to keep you docile while something moved quietly beneath the surface. Midway through a folder labeled Personal Affairs, I found a printed email exchange between the lawyer and an accountancy firm. The message was dated 2 weeks before Robert's passing. Attached to it was a draft of the estate summary. But the name at the top wasn't mine. It was Daniel's, listed as primary point of contact. That in itself wasn't suspicious. What followed was. The second page mentioned preliminary disbursement coordination, something that should only happen after the will is executed, not before. And at the bottom of the page, in faint pen, was the lawyer's signature dated 1 week before the reading. I leaned back, letting the chair creak beneath me. The sound reminded me of Robert's laughter, deep, slow, rare in recent years. For a brief moment, I missed him so fiercely it felt like physical pain. Then I looked again at the date, and the pain became clarity. Light shifted across the window blinds, slicing the room into pieces. Dust shimmered, gold and guilty. I opened the curtain wider. Outside, the garden looked as if it hadn't noticed any of this. Sunlight on leaves, the small hum of bees going about honest work. Inside, truth was starting to buzz too, restless and insistent. I took a breath and began to document everything. I wrote down dates, signatures, inconsistencies. The notebook became my quiet ally. Each new detail felt like lifting another corner of a rug and finding dust no one had bothered to sweep. When Claire visited later that afternoon, she found me surrounded by papers. "Mother," she said softly, "you look like a detective in a mystery you don't want to solve." I smiled faintly. "I suppose every widow becomes one eventually." "Maybe," she whispered. "Just promise you won't lose yourself chasing ghosts." "They're not ghosts," I said, holding up one of the pages. "They're receipts." She didn't argue. Instead, she kissed my forehead, the way she used to when I was sick, and left the room smelling faintly of lavender and worry. That night, I continued sorting documents under the lamplight. The rhythm of paper against paper began to sound like breathing. And then, almost by accident, I found it. A single folded note tucked into an envelope labeled Administrative Fees. I opened it and saw a payment confirmation. A large transfer made to the lawyer's office, dated April 27th. I froze. Robert had died in mid-May. The will was read in June. This payment, made weeks before the process even began, shouldn't exist. The handwriting authorizing the payment was neat, deliberate, but not Robert's. It wasn't mine either. It was the same calm, deliberate script I'd seen in the margins of the draft. The one that wrote, "He doesn't need to know." For a moment, I couldn't move. The hum of the lamp grew louder, the air heavier. It felt as though the entire house was holding its breath with me. The lawyer's voice returned to me then, almost tender in memory. Trust no one. And for the first time, I began to think, maybe he wasn't warning me. Maybe he was testing whether I'd obey. The next morning began like any other, quiet and brittle. But once you know where the cracks are, you can't stop hearing them. I sat at the dining table with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, staring at the documents spread before me. They looked harmless, black letters on white paper. But I'd begun to see them differently. Every line was a boundary. Every signature, a kind of fingerprint left on the conscience of someone trying to appear clean. I needed a system. Robert used to say that truth, like light, needs angles to reveal itself. So I made one. A timeline pinned to the corkboard, threads of red yarn connecting dates, letters, and names. To anyone else, it might have looked obsessive. To me, it was oxygen. At the top, I pinned 3 key dates: April 27th, the payment; May 14th, Robert sedated; June 2nd, will finalized. Each line between them formed a shape that looked almost like a snare. I started to notice patterns. Every time the lawyer mentioned fairness, an inconsistency followed. Every letter he wrote began with apology and ended with authority, a linguistic trap that sounded like compassion but functioned like control. When I compared the signatures, I found 2 variations of Robert's name, one strong and angular, his real hand, the other softer, as if traced. I held both against the light. The ink of the second shone slightly blue, not black. A pen difference, a day difference, a truth too deliberate to be accidental. By noon, I had filled 2 notebooks with notes and cross-references. My handwriting grew tighter, smaller, like someone whispering through ink. The air in the study thickened. The clock on the wall ticked too loudly. Then the house began to breathe. Daniel's voice down the hall, Claire's laughter too careful, Emma's piano keys drifting from the parlor. Even the music seemed hesitant, landing softly, afraid to disturb something fragile. I gathered my pages before they could see. But Daniel, of course, noticed. "Mother," he said from the doorway, "you're exhausting yourself over shadows." "Shadows exist only where something stands in the light," I replied. He frowned. "You always did love metaphors." "I'm learning to love evidence more." He didn't like that. Men like Daniel are allergic to ambiguity unless they're the ones controlling it. He turned to go, but hesitated. "If you're implying someone took advantage of Father, you're walking a dangerous line." "Then maybe it's time someone walked it." When he left, I felt the silence he'd carried with him settle like dust. Claire came later, eyes soft, voice steady. "Mother, Daniel worries for you." "Daniel worries for appearances," I said gently. "He thinks grief is making you see conspiracies." "And what do you think?" "I think you've never been wrong about people," she whispered. "Just early." That night, Emma found me by the window, where light spilled in ribbons across the floor. "Do you remember what Father used to say?" she asked. "About truth?" "Yes, that it doesn't need to shout." I nodded. "Then let's listen closely." Together, we reviewed the papers. Her young eyes caught details mine had missed. A difference in letter spacing, a clause inserted mid-paragraph, words that looked harmless until you compared them to the previous version. The clause read, In acknowledgement of services rendered and familial support, secondary beneficiary shall receive discretionary allocation. A mouthful of legality, but underneath it, a simple theft. "Who's the secondary beneficiary?" Emma asked. The question hung in the air like smoke. I flipped through the folder. The names were redacted in the drafts I had. Only the lawyer's initials followed each notation. "We'll need to find the unredacted version," I said. "How?" "By asking questions the polite way first." I scheduled a meeting for the next morning. The lawyer's office was housed in an old brick building downtown, the kind that smelled of ambition and furniture polish. The receptionist greeted me with practiced sympathy. "Mrs. Hale, how are you holding up?" "Still upright," I said. "That's a start." In his office, the lawyer smiled, that same restrained warmth he wore like a tailored suit. "Margaret," he said, gesturing toward the chair opposite his, "I was hoping you'd come by. There are a few loose ends to finalize." Loose ends. The phrase made my pulse quicken. He spoke of legal technicalities, clauses, and revisions as though reading a weather report. I watched his hands instead of his mouth again. They were too calm, too rehearsed, every gesture an echo. At one point, he leaned back and said, "You know, your husband had immense faith in fairness. He believed everyone deserved protection." I smiled faintly. He also believed that fairness shouldn't require secrecy. A flicker, a breath caught, then he recovered. "Of course, transparency is vital." "Then I'd like to review all versions of the will," I said. His smile thinned. "Naturally, though I must check which copies are releasable." There it was, that delicate pivot from courtesy to control. I nodded, stood, and left without pressing further. But before I reached the door, he said softly, "I hope you're not confusing grief with suspicion." I paused. "And I hope you're not confusing discretion with deceit." The ride home felt longer than it should. The city outside the car window blurred into streaks of light, reflections of things half seen and half believed. When I reached home, Claire was waiting with a folder in her hands. "The courier delivered this," she said. "It's marked confidential." I took it, my fingers trembling only slightly. Inside were copies of correspondence between the lawyer and an unknown recipient. Each page stamped private. The emails discussed family dynamics and inheritance sensitivity. On the last page, my eyes caught a familiar word: beneficiary. Beside it, a name handwritten in the same gentle cursive I'd grown to recognize. It wasn't Daniel's name. It wasn't Claire's, not Emma's. It was Nora, my daughter-in-law. The air left the room like a sigh. For a moment, I thought I might faint, but anger steadied me. Not loud anger, but the cold, clarifying kind that makes the world fall into perfect focus. Nora, the woman who called me mother with polished lips, who offered tea when she wanted silence, who smiled at my grief as though it were inconvenient decor. I looked again at the handwriting, certain now. The lawyer's note read simply, "Ensure discretion. The family must remain intact." Intact. What a polite word for betrayal. I closed the folder slowly, the paper trembling just enough to betray the storm inside me. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, as if the sky itself was taking notes. And in that sound, I made a quiet promise to myself. Not vengeance, not rage, but revelation. The truth would breathe again. The day of the meeting arrived with rain, not heavy, but constant, the kind that blurs edges and forces everything to slow down. The drive to the lawyer's office felt like crossing into a courtroom built of silence. I had slept little, though I'd learned that exhaustion can make truth sharper, like glass that catches the light just before it cuts. Claire offered to come with me. I declined. Some truths require solitude to stand properly upright. The office smelled of polished wood and wet coats. The secretary led me into the same conference room where, weeks earlier, the words, "Trust no one," had first entered my bloodstream. The table gleamed with its reflection, papers arranged in perfect symmetry, the illusion of order doing what it does best, hiding chaos. He entered moments later, composed as always. "Mrs. Hale," he said, voice smooth. "I'm glad you called this meeting." "I'm sure you are," I replied. "It saves you the trouble of pretending surprise later." He blinked once, the kind of blink that doesn't quite reach the muscles of the face. "You sound troubled." "I'm not troubled," I said, placing the folder on the table. "I'm prepared." He looked at it, then at me, and for a second I thought I saw something shift behind his calm, not guilt yet, but caution. "Shall we begin?" he asked. "I already have." I opened the folder and slid the first page toward him, the payment receipt dated April 27th. "Unusual," I said. "A transaction made before the will was even finalized." He examined it briefly. "Advance retainer, common in these cases." "Perhaps, but not when it's issued from the estate being settled." I laid down the next page, the handwritten clause about secondary beneficiary consideration. "This one is harder to explain." His pen tapped once against the table, echoing the first day we met. "Margaret, I assure you—" "Please," I interrupted softly. "Don't call me Margaret. Today you'll call me Mrs. Hale." The room stilled. Outside, the rain softened as if to listen. He tried again. "The clause was drafted to protect family harmony. Your husband—" "My husband," I said, believed in clarity. "You, on the other hand, believe in discretion." I pulled out the next page, the correspondence naming Nora as the secondary beneficiary. His eyes caught the name, and I saw it, the flicker, the smallest hesitation. Proof enough for me. "You authorized a transfer," I said, "to someone you described as a stabilizing influence within the family. You concealed it in legal phrasing so polite it could pass through customs unnoticed." He exhaled through his nose. "Nora came to me concerned about your ability to manage—" "My grief?" I asked. "Or my inheritance?" His silence answered for him. I leaned forward. "You manipulated the process to benefit her. You adjusted clauses. You predated payments. You used my husband's illness as a curtain. The only question left," I said, voice quiet, "is whether you did it for loyalty or profit." He sat back, folding his hands, a man measuring which lie would sound most like reason. "Everything I did was to protect what Robert valued most, stability. Families fall apart over wills. I prevented that." I smiled, slow and deliberate. "You prevented truth, not chaos." For a long moment he said nothing. The rain resumed, a soft applause against the windows. "You don't understand," he whispered finally. "Robert knew. He approved it." The words landed like a slow knife. "You're saying he chose to disinherit me?" "No," he said quickly. "He rebalanced. He wanted Nora to receive part of what she managed so well for Daniel. It was his way of acknowledging deceit?" He flinched, barely, then quietly. "His way of keeping peace." Peace. A beautiful word that has hidden more crimes than hate ever has. I stood, gathering the papers slowly. "You've built a fortress out of language. I've lived long enough to know that fortresses can become prisons." He looked at me, face pale, voice suddenly fragile. "Mrs. Hale, if this comes out, it will destroy your family. Is that what you want?" I held his gaze. "No. What I want is for the truth to breathe. Whatever it destroys deserves it." At that moment, the door opened. Daniel, Claire, Emma, and Nora stood in the threshold. They had arrived earlier than expected, summoned by my message that morning. "Please be present when the truth arrives." Daniel looked confused. "Mother, what is this?" The lawyer's face drained of color. "This is highly irregular." "No," I said. "This is clarity." I laid the documents on the table. Every line, every payment, every signature that does not belong. Claire's hand trembled as she reached for the paper. Emma stood behind her, steady and silent. Nora's face, carefully composed as ever, cracked just enough around the eyes. Daniel picked up one page, then another. "Is this true?" he demanded. The lawyer swallowed. "There are complexities." "Complexities?" Daniel's voice rose. "You manipulated our father's will." "I acted in the family's best interest," he said, his tone turning defensive. "You have no idea how fragile these matters are." "Fragile," I said softly. "Yes, like trust. Once broken, it never looks the same." The room dissolved into murmurs and shock. I didn't join the noise. I watched, observed. The truth has its own choreography. Guilt leans back, innocence leans forward. Nora stepped closer, eyes glistening. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," she whispered. "He said it was only temporary, until the estate stabilized." Her voice cracked. For the first time, she looked like someone who understood what moral debt feels like. Daniel turned to me, face torn between rage and disbelief. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you wouldn't have listened," I said. "You would have defended him, as you always do." He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. Silence settled. The lawyer removed his glasses, polishing them as if clarity were a choice. "Mrs. Hale," he said finally, voice low, "if you take this public, it will ruin reputations. Mine, Nora's, possibly your own." I gathered the papers into a single stack. Reputation is what people believe about you. Integrity is what remains when they stop believing. He stared at me for a long time, then sighed. "You're right," he said. "It was wrong. I let her persuade me. I told myself I was protecting everyone, but I was protecting myself." There it was, the confession. Soft, uneventful, the kind of truth that doesn't shout, just ends. Daniel looked ready to speak, but I raised a hand. "Not now." The room felt thinner. The air stretched tight with everything that had been said and everything that hadn't. The rain stopped. The silence that followed was deeper than any prayer I'd ever heard. He looked at me then, the lawyer, stripped of poise, his pen finally still. "What will you do now?" he asked. I didn't answer. Not yet, because some justice requires the silence that comes before the verdict. Morning arrived with a clean, winter-kind light, the sort that makes even dust look honest. I brewed tea I didn't intend to drink and laid the documents out on the dining table as if setting places for guests who had finally learned my name. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger is a fire that burns the cook first. What I felt was colder and clearer, a need for the world to match the weight of its words. I called him at 9. The lawyer answered on the second ring, voice composed, already dressed in apology. "We should meet," I said. "Yes," he replied. "Today." "Today," I said, "and here." By noon, he stood at my door, raincoat folded over his arm like a truce. He looked smaller without his office. Men often do when removed from their furniture. Nora arrived soon after, eyes rimmed with the red of sleeplessness, posture carefully arranged as if shame had a dress code. Daniel and Claire stood in the doorway, not as guards, but as witnesses. Emma lingered near the window, fingers resting on the latch as if choosing whether to invite the world in. We sat. I did not offer tea. Sometimes kindness confuses the lesson. He began with a practiced sigh. "Mrs. Hale, I am prepared to accept responsibility for—" "No," I said gently. "You are prepared to accept consequences. Those are not the same." His eyes shifted, as if searching for a smaller truth to hide behind. When none appeared, he nodded. "I have written terms," I said, sliding a page across the table. "You will read them aloud." He lifted the paper, the crispness of it louder than anyone's breath. "Full restitution of any funds moved without explicit authorization," he read, voice even. "Renunciation of all fees associated with the estate. a letter of public retraction confessing conflict of interest and procedural manipulation, to be notarized and sent to the family and the firm's board. He paused there, throat tight, then continued. Transfer of all drafts, notes, and correspondence pertaining to the will. Coordination with an independent counsel to ensure corrective filing. A formal apology to Mrs. Hale, to be delivered in this room. He set the paper down. Is there more? There is, I said. I reached into the drawer of Robert's desk and placed a small, empty leather pouch on the table, the kind that used to hold a watch. Something that was taken must be returned. Nora's breath caught. I never meant to empty things quietly, I asked. Intent is a kind word. It doesn't always tell the truth about behavior. She closed her eyes, then opened them with a steadier resolve. From her handbag, she removed Robert's pocket watch. Silver worn smooth by time, the lid engraved with an R that never rushed. She placed it in the center of the table as if returning a heartbeat. The room tilted toward it. Daniel swallowed. Daniel. That was Father's favorite, he said, softer than I expected. Yes, I replied. He used to wind it before big decisions. He said a good decision begins with a steady measure of time. The lawyer nodded once, a concession to something older than his training. I will sign. Not yet, I said. Read the apology. He looked up, startled. Now? Now, I answered. Words are braver when they arrive early. He unfolded a second sheet, hands trembling, the pen finally honest in his grip. His voice hollowed out into sincerity. I am sorry, he read. I acted in fear, of conflict, of disorder, of losing the control I believed kept families from breaking. I let discretion become a costume for deceit. I failed, Robert. I failed you, Mrs. Hale. I used your grief as cover for my convenience. I ask forgiveness, though I don't deserve it. I accept whatever judgment restores what I fractured. Silence followed. The kind of silence that doesn't need a prayer because it already is one. Emma spoke first. Truth is an instrument, she said. Sometimes it plays softly so people will listen. He lowered his eyes. I will resign from the estate. I will notify the firm. I will file the letter. Good, I said, but understand, this is not the end of your obligation. Integrity does not happen on paper. It happens at inconvenient hours when no one is watching. He nodded, and I believed that for once, his nod cost him something. We moved through signatures, each stroke of ink an unmaking of what had been quietly made. The notary, called by Claire, arrived with the ordinary dignity of those who carry authority in a stamp. Documents clicked into place, copies multiplied like witnesses. When it was done, I felt something uncoil under my ribs. Not triumph, not relief, a decentering, like furniture finally returned to where it had always belonged. May I speak to you alone? Nora asked. Daniel stiffened. I lifted a hand. 5 minutes, I said. Then we are finished. We stood in the doorway of the study, the same room that had learned my breathing during the worst nights. She held herself with the care of someone who had dropped too many plates and grown expert at sweeping quietly. I thought I was protecting Daniel, she whispered. He worries about money, about provision. I wanted to shoulder what I could. The lawyer made it sound like permission, not theft. Permission from whom? I asked. From paper? From a man who profits from smoothness? I softened my tone. Protection without truth is just a prettier word for control. Tears smudged her mascara. She didn't wipe them away. I am sorry, she said. I will spend years being sorry. Good, I said, not unkindly. Remorse is a seed. If you water it with honesty, something living can grow. If you water it with excuses, it rots. She nodded. What should I do now? Return more than objects, I said. Return your hunger for advantage. Return your instinct to decorate deceit with good intentions. I paused, listening to my own words. and returned to Daniel without the need to be necessary. We rejoined the others. The lawyer stood. "Mrs. Hale," he said, "there is one more item." He reached into his briefcase and produced a small envelope. Inside was a letter on thick paper, the firm's crest pressed like a scar in the corner. "I drafted this last night," he said. "I didn't know if I would have the courage to deliver it." I opened it. The words were simple. No ornament. One line caught me by the wrist. "I confused peace with silence. You taught me the difference." I looked up. "Then learn the right way to keep peace," I said, "by airing out rooms before they mold." He signed the last document. The notary stamped the final page with a sound like a door closing. When he and the notary left, the house exhaled. It is strange how walls can feel braver once truth has touched them. Daniel leaned against the table, as if the truth had weight and he'd been carrying it in the wrong muscles. "Mother," he said quietly, "I don't know how to apologize for not seeing." "You weren't asked to see," I replied. "You were asked to agree." He flinched at that precision. Then he stepped forward, took my hands, and kissed the top of my head like a son who had remembered his first language. "Teach me," he said. "I can learn." Claire smiled through tears that didn't disturb her poise. Emma wound the pocket watch gently and placed it in my palm. The tick returned, soft, measured, alive. Not loud. Enough. We gathered the papers into new folders labeled honestly. Evidence became history. History became instruction. I opened the living room window. Air entered like clarity, lifting the curtains in a rhythm that felt familiar. Outside, the world continued its small, faithful work, leaves negotiating with wind, light practicing forgiveness across the lawn. We chose an independent counsel recommended by Samuel Carter, a man who does not treat truth as a hobby. He reviewed the case without flattery. "This can be corrected," he said, "and it will be." In his office, I felt no need to count my breaths. The firm published the retraction that evening. The letter traveled to inboxes and surprised the people who make a living, assuming nothing ever really happens. It named the manipulation without performing it, confessed the conflict without rehearsing it into an excuse, and offered restitution as something more than math. I didn't read the comments. The public is a weather system. It changes direction without warning. I was interested only in what stayed standing once the gusts passed. Before bed, I returned to the box of Robert's letters. The string gave way with a clean, unregretful sound. I found one written years ago after a difficult season when we almost forgot how to speak gently. "If ever our home loses its light," he had written, "open the windows. Truth doesn't enter through locked doors." He had drawn a small square beside the sentence. A window, 4 panes, a childish sketch that still understood architecture. I placed the letter beside the pocket watch on my nightstand. The house was quiet, but not the old suffocating kind. This was a quiet with lungs. I didn't pray for forgiveness for him or for them. I prayed for endurance, the kind that lets mercy keep its balance without becoming permissive. Then I turned out the lamp and let the dark be friendly for once. Morning returned with an ordinary softness. Breakfast tasted like food, not obligation. I ran my fingers over the watch, felt the pulse it kept faithfully, the circle of time that does not apologize for moving forward. In the afternoon, the lawyer's letter arrived by courier, the original, signed in thick black ink, not the trembling blue that had haunted the will. I placed it in a new folder marked Repaired. Not resolved. Repairs show their seams if you look closely. It's good to remember where the cloth held. Emma joined me in the study. "Does justice always feel this quiet?" she asked. "Sometimes," I said. "Loud justice is for breaking locks. Quiet justice is for opening windows." We stood by the open window and let the air do what it does best, insist on itself. Before dinner, I wound the pocket watch again. The tick measured the room with a patience that humbled me. I thought of the first day in that conference room, the pen tapping like a false clock, the man telling me to trust no one. I should have asked why. Maybe he would have told me he was afraid of truth's appetite, afraid of the way it eats hypocrisy first. Now, when I think of trust, I don't imagine a person, I imagine light. It doesn't swear loyalty. It simply shows up and makes secrets explain themselves. I closed the study door and walked down the hall toward the kitchen where the kettle was beginning to sing. I liked the sound. It was a small, domestic triumph, an ordinary proof that heat becomes comfort when watched. Before I turned the corner, I heard the faintest sound, the click of a latch settling without locking. The window had shifted slightly in a new breeze. It didn't need a key to behave. And as evening folded itself across the house, I realized there was one more letter to write. Not to the lawyer, not to the firm, not even to Robert. A letter to the part of me that had mistaken politeness for faith, that had tried to be smaller so the world wouldn't notice I was right. I sat at the desk, the pocket watch steady beside me, and picked up my pen. I began. I wrote by the open window, the evening making a quiet map across the floor. The pocket watch lay beside my hand, a small circle that refused to hurry. I addressed the letter not to a person, but to what needed hearing. To the part of me that mistook politeness for faith, and to anyone who has ever lowered their voice so someone else wouldn't feel small. I was told to trust no one, and for a while I obeyed the sound without asking the sentence its history. Obedience can be a kind of sleep. I learned to wake by degrees, first to the rustle of paper that said too much in careful ways, then to the hush inside my ribs that knew when a thing was wrong before my mouth could name it. Truth doesn't knock. It comes with its own key and expects you to make space. Trust, I have discovered, is not a face. It is a light. You don't owe it to people who dim your windows to admire their darkness. You owe it to the room you live in to keep the air moving. Some will call that suspicion. I call it stewardship. I used to think dignity was what you wore when the world stared. Now I think it's how you breathe when no one is watching. It is the unglamorous work of asking why, not to accuse, but to align. Why did the pen hesitate? Why did the date arrive early? Why did the words sound like comfort, but move like control? The questions were not daggers. They were handles. They helped me lift what was too heavy to carry without them. There were days I wanted fury. It would have been delicious to light every match and call the fire justice. I didn't. Anger is a landlord who charges too much for too little shelter. I chose the slower architecture, windows, fresh air, a watch wound by a steady hand. I chose to let the house live. If you are reading this with a pen in your lap and the old ache in your chest, hear me. You are allowed to ask for the lights to be turned on. You are allowed to stand so the shadow has to move around you. You are allowed to correct the records even if the room prefers the story as it was. Corrections are not betrayals. They are repairs. Robert once drew a small window in the margin of a letter and told me, "Open what you can bear, then bear what you open." I did not understand it then. I thought he was being poetic because love makes people brave in easy ways. Now I know what he meant. Open is not a mood. It is a practice. It is the latch choosing to be a hinge. I forgave where I could, which is to say, I told the truth about what happened and asked it not to happen again. Sometimes forgiveness is a ribbon tied to a promise. Sometimes it's a seal broken on a document that finally says the right thing. Either way, it is not silence. Silence is a garden left to weeds and called wild. The watch ticks, steady as mercy when it remembers justice. I run my thumb across the lid and think of all the minutes we waste asking if peace will be offended by the truth. Peace is not fragile. Our performances are. If you are looking for instructions, I have only this. Keep a notebook. Date what you notice. Don't argue with your pulse. Listen to your rooms. Houses tell the truth in their own weather. Ask why before you sign, and when someone tells you to trust no one, ask why them first. You will learn what they fear. It's useful to know what fear is trying to protect. I do not hate the man who said those words to me. Pity has its uses, but it too can be a kind of perfume over rot. What I have is quieter, a refusal to be managed, a willingness to breathe differently. I set the documents to rights, not to humiliate anyone, but to teach the house how to hold itself again. The walls feel taller now. Even the forks sound honest when they return to their drawer. I will go on winding the watch. I will keep the window a little open and a little closed, the way a throat makes room for a voice. If people mistake my softness for an invitation to lie, I will open the window wider. If they mistake my firmness for cruelty, I will point to the light and let it explain me better than I can. Tonight I will sleep with the letter on my nightstand, the paper cooled by air that has touched the garden. Tomorrow will arrange itself the way mornings do, without my permission and with my blessing. There is bread to slice, a plant to move closer to the sun, a small repair in the hem of a curtain. I find God in the mending. If you need a benediction, have this one. Let the next choice be honest enough that your breath doesn't have to argue with it. Let the next room you enter be one you've aired. Let the next person who says trust show you the window latch before they show you their smile. The light is changing now. The page looks less like a demand and more like a door. I sign my name, not to finish, but to declare presence. Margaret. I fold the letter once, twice. The pocket watch answers with its patient measure. I stand, close the window with a soft touch, and leave it unlatched. The click is gentle, not a lock, just the sound of a frame remembering its place. In the hall, the house breathes. Something like quiet walks beside me, taller than before. And somewhere between the kitchen and my room, I hear what might be the beginning of another question.